Quick recap. So in the previous four sessions, we really started with, who is God? What is God's nature? We explored what was God's intention for creation. What did he really want and hope for at the beginning? And then we covered about what went wrong at the time of the fall and how did sin enter this world. And then the last session's session was on the course of history and how God has worked through history to restore humanity back to the original point where he wanted to create this kingdom of heaven and the role that the Messiah plays in getting there. So today's session is going to be the final section, and this is where we cover True Parents or Reverend Mrs. Moon's course and the blessing and the significance of that. So this is session number 5. So yeah, today we'll be going over the life and legacy of Reverend Samye Moon and Dr. Hak Ja Han Moon, also known as and referred to endearingly as True Parents. So I just want to start with a caveat. It is a lot of content to cover, but I do have a limited time. So I won't do it full justice, but I'm going to cover some of the main points. But there is other educational series that we have where you can go into more depth after this session. Okay, so this is really just a summary to give you a snapshot of all the different things that have happened in their lives. So to give some context, we want to also, knowing the providence of restoration, we know that history actually has meaning. It's not just random. There is God's intention behind history, and even the world wars, that there was some kind of intention behind that. So according to the principle, the world wars was a culmination of the final battle between Satan and God in these different realms of the first, second, and third blessing. So as you know, World War I started, was led by Wilhelm II with Germany, and really kind of, basically battling, and we know that certain countries actually represented Satan's side and certain countries on God's side. And it ended in 1919. It started in 1914. And actually 1920 was when Father Moon was born. So we do, from a principal perspective, there was this condition where this final battle, a world level, the first world level battle happened, and the conclusion of which allowed a foundation for the second coming to be born. So Father Moon was born February 1920 in Jeongju, North Korea, in a farmland area. And if you look at the Korean map, right now, the North Korea is where that red dot is. That's where Father Moon was born. When Father Moon was born, actually, by the way, this is an image of the house where Moon was born. And Korea was under Japanese occupation. So at that time, there was no North and South Korea. It was just Korea, but it was occupied by Japan. And if you look in the background of this image, it's a mountainous area. And Father Moon used to go to the mountains to pray when he was a child. He actually enjoyed nature a lot. Apparently really made his parents go crazy because he would disappear for sometimes days on end. And as you know, any parent would kind of freak out with that kind of child. But he really enjoyed like exploring nature and chasing animals. learning from them, things like that. However, around that time, there was a lot of suffering going on under the Japanese occupation. Many Christians were tortured and even killed for their faith. And so he really wondered during this war-torn era, why was there so much suffering? And during this time, I think at age 15 or 16, he wrote this poem called The Crown of Glory. I'm going to read it to you. When I doubt people, I feel pain. When I judge people, it is unbearable. When I hate people, there is no value to my existence. Yet if I believe, I am deceived. If I love, I am betrayed. Suffering and grieving tonight, my head in my hands. Am I wrong? Yes, I am wrong. Even though we are deceived, still believe. Though we are betrayed, still forgive. Love completely even those who hate you. Wipe your tears away and welcome with a smile those who know nothing but deceit and those who betray without regret. O Master, the pain of loving. Look at my hands. Place your hand on my chest. My heart is bursting, such agony. But when I love those who acted against me, I brought victory. If you have done the same thing, I will give you the crown of glory. By Sun Myung Moon. So yeah, it's kind of reflects the kind of lifestyle and what was going on in his life around that time. There was a lot of struggle and suffering and deep questioning about the existence of God and the reason for suffering and all of these things that are really quite painful and deep messages that you can see in this poem. Right around that time, on Easter morning, 1935, so this was when he was just 15 years old, during his one of his deep prayers, midnight prayers that he had during that time, he was visited by Jesus. And during that visitation, Jesus asked Samyang was his name, Youngmyung was his name, to really inherit this mission. And this is a kind of a message from the autobiography as a peace-loving global citizen that explains like what was going through his mind when he was visited by Jesus. So why did God call me? Of all the people in the world, why did he choose me? I was just an unremarkable, stubborn, and foolish young boy. If God saw something in me, it must have been a sincere heart that sought him with tears of love. Whatever the time or place, love is most important. God was searching for a person who would live with a heart of love and who, when faced with suffering, could cut off its effects with love. I was a boy in a rural village with nothing to show for myself. Even now, I insist uncompromisingly on sacrificing my life to live for God's love and nothing else. So, yeah, as the story goes, at first he denied or he rejected the request. I mean, just imagine, you know, how you'd feel if you had a visitation to kind of take on a mission like this to restore the world. But when he realized that, you know, if you know the sincerity of the request that was coming, plus if he didn't accept it, then someone else would have to kind of receive the burden of this mission. That was what compelled him to accept and commit to this mission. So since that time, for the next 10 years, he went on a deep search of the truth. There was actually in the museum, there are the original like Bibles that Reverend Moon used in his youth, but it is like there's a Korean, Japanese, and an English version, and it's very worn out because of how much time he spent really going through scripture to search for the truth. And it wasn't just through study, but prayer, meditation, all kinds of things to really find out the deeper truths hidden in scripture. He also married during this time into a devout Christian family and prepared to launch his ministry after the end of World War II. So going back to the World War significance, as we said, at the end of World War I, due to the victory of the Allied powers, there was a foundation for the birth of the Second Coming. And then for World War II, at the end of it, again, the Allied powers were able to gain victory over Adolf Hitler and the Axis powers. And because of that victory, at the end of 1945, Reverend Moon was able to kind of start his ministry on that foundation. And then the third level, now World War III didn't physically happen, but the Cold War is, or rather, yeah, this kind of, a war of ideologies is considered this kind of third world war between communism and Christianity. And this was a battle between atheism and Godism. Yeah, this was also a very significant kind of battle that happened. This was Stalin. He was in power through 1950, I think, 1951 or 2. But also, yeah, there was a foundation of victory there, which allowed for providence to continue. However, we're going to go into this. Everything didn't go as planned. Originally, at that time after World War II, within the next 7 years, things were prepared for everything to go smoothly and kind of for world restoration to happen. But unfortunately, the people that were prepared, kind of the John the Baptist figures at that time, didn't quite receive Reverend Moon as the second coming, and therefore the providence had to be extended. So here's some examples of that. So there were Christian spiritual groups. Many of them emerged in Korea to prepare for the second coming, and one of the key leading figure was a group called the Israel Monastery, founded by Kim Baek-moon. And this is in a message that Kim Baek-moon and I were in the position of Cain and Abel, like John the Baptist and Jesus. He was at the highest spiritual level in the life of faith among all the established churches. So this was in southern Korea. He was kind of a leading Christian figure at that time. Yeah, he goes, this is Reverend Moon's words. He says, once Kim's church united with me, that would have been the completion level of the group. Then I would have needed to make unity between this group and the rest of the mainline churches. Later, we should have connected to the government. So actually, Reverend Moon went to serve this church for many years and really won over the heart of the pastor, which was Kim Baek-moon. And at one point, Kim Baek-moon did get a revelation where he said a message similar to what John the Baptist said, really honoring Father as a central person. Yeah, he should have asked me everything about me. That was his 5% portion of responsibility. Some of his dedicated followers started to follow me, and he did not feel good about losing his followers. Because Kim Baek-moon was close to Dr. Syngman Rhee, who was the president of South Korea, he was a John the Baptist figure. God's will could have been realized at the time, but it didn't work out. So although initially, Kim Baek-moon really honored Father for his dedication to God and his kind of really spiritual sense of the direction of God's will and God's heart, the human nature side of really seeing his followers really honoring Father Moon more than him got the better of him and led to his disbelief and jealousy and ultimately a break between these two. But he was, Kim Baek-moon was very close with Dr. Syngman Rhee. So if he had united, as John the Baptist should have, with Jesus and really supported Reverend Moon at that time, then it was possible for all of Korea to be, starting with the president, connected to this new truth. So after that failure, Chu Father had to go to, he got a revelation and he went back into North Korea. And in North Korea, there was another group that was prepared. This was a group called, led by a person named Ho Ho Bin. Among the prepared women's spiritual groups in the north, the Inside the Womb Church received the revelation from God that the Messiah is coming through a woman's womb, not from the clouds in the sky. They were witnessing based on these revelations. Mrs. Ho Ho Bin and the main members of the church were imprisoned at that time because of proselytizing. And Chu Father was accused by the Communist Party and taken into the same jail where Mrs. Ho Ho Bin was being detained. So it was interesting. It's actually, they met in prison. That was kind of the interesting providence that happened at that time. During that time, Father wrote a letter on a piece of paper to Mrs. Ho Ho Bin, quote, "You need to pray about who sent this letter. If you deny all the things that you received in Revelation, you will be freed from this jail." Piece of paper of this paper was found by the prison guard, and I was severely tortured. It was 2 p.m. on September 18th. So Reverend Moon really wanted to encourage Mrs. Ho Ho Bin to kind of deny her revelation so that she could survive, live, be let go, and he was going to meet up with her afterwards. And even Mrs. Ho Ho Bin received a revelation through her dreams that she would meet the second coming in prison, but she couldn't let go of her kind of, I don't know if it's pride, but like, you know, you really trust the revelations you've been receiving, so she couldn't just trust you know, Reverend Moon, who she didn't really know. If she had prayed really deeply, maybe she could have gotten a revelation to really acknowledge that she should follow the direction here, but she didn't. Therefore, unfortunately, she was basically tortured and she died soon after in prison. Father Moon was also tortured during this time, and he was pretty much left for dead. His body was basically thrown out of the prison, being expected to die, and his followers kind of picked up his unconscious body, and yeah, this was also a very miraculous recovery where he was able to recover and continue his ministry. There's a quote, "Church members increased when I restarted witnessing activities. At that time, the North Korean government policy was to eliminate all religion. Many established church ministers accused me due to a loss of congregants and reported their accusations to the authorities." So yet again, as his ministry started to grow in North Korea because of those who didn't trust him and those who felt threatened by the growth of his ministry, it was actually ironically, it was the church ministers who accused Father Moon and got the communist authorities to jail him, basically, arrest him. So he was arrested again in February of 1948 and taken into detention. So he was sentenced at this point to 5 years of hard labor in Hunnam prison. This was in 1948. That means he's 28 years old, and he's sentenced to this prison. Now, you have to understand, this prison was notorious. The average lifespan was basically 3 years in this prison. It was a labor camp where you were worked and starved to death. So basically, being sentenced to 5 years means that it's basically a death sentence. But again, he tried to start the ministry in the south. The John the Baptist figure failed. Then he went to the north. Again, John the Baptist figure failed. And then he had to go through this kind of crucifixion course at Hunnam prison. So there was a chemical, it was a chemical fertilizer plant. Many people were starved to death. There are stories where the portion of food was so small that when it was sometimes like prisoners would die from starvation in mid meal, and the other prisoners, if they noticed that a prisoner died, they would actually even go and take the rice that was in the mouth of the one that just died to get the food from that. So that was how terrible the situation was in at that time. But Roemun, he never prayed for his own safety or his own freedom, but he always prayed, even at that time, dire situation, to comfort God, saying that, don't worry, God, I got this, I won't die here. And he was really praying to try to encourage and comfort God, even during this difficult time. And due to his really service and love, and he even though the portions were so small, he would actually share his food, share his clothing, support those who were kind of weaker in the labor. And he won the Labor of the Year award 2 years in a row during that time. He gained 12 disciples, more and more during that time. And almost 3 years into the labor camp, the Korean War started, and the UN sent forces and bombed this area where the labor camp was, and miraculously he was liberated after 2 years and 8 months of serving in this labor camp. There's also a story where, they knew that war was approaching, so they started to execute all the prisoners. And he was scheduled to be executed the day after the UN forces had done the bombing. So in the nick of time, he was really saved and liberated from the death camp. So yeah, after going through that kind of really excruciating course, he miraculously survived at Hunnam prison. He then traveled south to build his own foundation for the Messiah, and launched a 4-year course of indemnity. So if you remember back to kind of Jesus's course in the Providence of Restoration, if John the Baptist had united, the course would have been so much easier. But due to the failure of the John the Baptist figure, Jesus had to rebuild his own foundation, kind of be his own John the Baptist, and go through trials to set a new foundation before he could stand in that position again. So similarly, because of the failure of the John the Baptist figures to unite, Roemun had to go through this kind of crucifixion course, and fortunately he survived so that he could rebuild that foundation. This is just an image of one of his disciples injured his leg, had a broken leg, and Reverend Moon was determined to bring him with him to the South, and many times had to carry him on his back even to bring him. So over those course of 40 years, he launched the Holy Spirit Association for the Unification of World Christianity. A shorter version is HSAUWC, which was founded in 1954. And he built that over 40 years. This is one of the earliest, the first church, quote unquote, he built. This was after Hunan prison. He went to the South and he built a cardboard hut out of the rations boxes from the US Army that was kind of positioned in South Korea at that time. Starting there, he would, he actually, I think around that time, he wrote the Divine Principle and he started witnessing to people. This is one university called the Ewha Women's University, where many of the students and even the professors were transformed with the principle and started to follow and join the church. And yet again, because of the increasing rate of kind of conversion and people joining Reverend Moon's church, there were vicious rumors that were generated from Christians, and again, he was led to jail because of those accusations. This is in the 1950s, but fortunately this time, the government, after really searching and questioning and everything, the government declared his innocence and freed Reverend Moon, so he was able to continue his ministries. As I mentioned, during this time, all the kind of revelations were compiled into the exposition of the Divine Principle, which you kind of all heard a summary of during these past 5 sessions. But I want to encourage you to also, after this, to read through the text yourself, because there's so much powerful and deep truths in the text. Through revelation, and yeah, very insightful in terms of understanding deeper truths and how it applies to your life. So we're going to fast forward from there. So the ministry grew in Korea, and then in the early 70s, God called Reverend Moon to go to America. So yeah, you have to imagine, you know, from a third world country, war-torn South Korea, to, you know, to abandon the foundation that was built there to go to America, a foreign land. You know, he basically left everything in Korea on God's call to go to America, knowing that, you know, America is God's central nation. He felt compelled by God to go and restore or share this message to Americans. So this is an image of him speaking in Madison Square Garden in 1974. Also, since that time, he traveled the world, and this was a major rally in South Korea, 1974, Yoido Plaza. 1.2 million people gathered. And this was also a message. The main message was anti-communism, that God is alive and that the ideology of communism is false. Also, a couple of years later, Washington Monument, I think it was a little over 300,000 people gathered to hear Reverend Moon's speech in Washington, D.C. Other significant meetings after that rally, he felt called that he needs to go to Moscow and meet Gorbachev. You gotta imagine, like, you know, his main ministry at that time was message was anti-communism, but he felt compelled again from God to visit and embrace the top communist leaders at that time. And it's really an example of, you know, hating the sin, but not the sinner, and loving the people, loving them to death, or not to death, but like loving them to a point where their heart is transformed. So he was very clear that, you know, it was the ideology, the concept that God is dead that was wrong, not the people. And so he really went to embrace, and in this meeting really encouraged Gorbachev to open his doors, let go of the communist approaches, and embrace a more open approach. Here on the right, Father Moon is embracing Kim Il-sung, North Korea. Now you have to imagine, this is the guy that literally tried to have Reverend Moon killed many times. But he actually risked his life to visit him and really show that he really wants to reunify North and South Korea. And he even said straight out that his Juche ideology is false, and that he needs to embrace a God-centered ideology. Kim Il-sung was so kind of impressed with his boldness and his sincerity and his like determination and love, that he was able to open his heart and said, if there's anyone you need to trust in this world, it's Reverend Moon. So it didn't stop there. He continued traveling the world, sharing the message of the principle of God, of global peace. And this is one speech in the Palace of Nations in Geneva in the 90s. One really major proposal that Reverend Moon pushed forward was having an interfaith council at the UN, really tapping into the people of faith, and to draw upon the wisdom of the faith leaders of the world in order to address global issues. So again, many projects were initiated. This is another organization, Universal Peace Federation, founded in 2005. Since then, there's been so many other organizations that were established, all for the sake of increasing cooperation and establishing peace around the world. This is another major project called the Middle East Peace Initiative, or MEPI, where there were hundreds and thousands of ministers sent to Israel for marching for peace and really reconciliation between Islam, Christian, and Judaism. These three central Judeo-Christian and Islamic faiths, to really reconcile and to work with each other. So even from way back when and even now, there's a lot of efforts towards interfaith leaders coming together in symbolizing unity and peace. Oh, one other major area, and there's only one slide to kind of highlight this, is called Ocean Providence. Father Moon really loved the ocean, spent days and months and even years in the water, I would say, during his lifetime, fishing in waters all around the world. And yeah, there's many beautiful quotes about how he senses God's presence in the ocean. And one of the main things he wanted to do with the Ocean Providence was to address world hunger. He felt like if we can dominate the seas, we can actually have enough food to serve, to feed all the people in the world without trouble. And so he really initiated this seafood industry. In fact, he was the one who brought popularized sashimi in America. No one really ate raw fish in America until Reverend Moon brought True World Group and started really opening up restaurants and things to really for the health of the American people, and also to really expand this seafood industry. And final slide here, in 2012, that was 8 years ago, Father Moon passed, I think at the age of 92. And yeah, he lived quite a full life, really leaving quite a legacy. And since that time, you know, I remember when it happened, it was still a shock. I mean, he's already pretty, sorry, he's 1920, right? So 80, 92, yeah. So he's already in his late 90s, so it wouldn't be a surprise for someone at that age to pass. But I remember it was truly a shock when he did. Kind of felt like he would, you know, live to 100 or 120, but he passed. And yeah, it was a solemn time because we all really grown to love and trust him, and there was still so much. Even at that age, he was still running around the world, you know, sharing the message and continuing to do God's will. So it was a shock, but fortunately, Mother Moon at that time really continued to stand and inherit and continue to move God's providence forward. So that is a wrap.